honor to present Jim McCormick, who's doing the fourth in his series, and we have been very blessed to have Jim here for fourth. So thank you, and it's your turn.
My plan was to get here early to get these spread out one of the tables. Would someone help me just spread these out?
Yep.
I'll tell you something about those in just a moment. Have you ever had days when nothing seemed to work out well?
Lots of them. Yes.
I stayed up late last night to watch the Braves clinch the World Series. Go Braves. So, yeah, that was great, but I was running a little late this morning. So I got up and walked down the hallway from our apartment to the elevator, down the elevator, out to the car, only to discover I didn't have my car keys. So I had to reverse that, go back up, get more tense all the time, came back down, got into the car. 2 blocks from the apartment, there was a road race and they sent me in a detour. About 10 blocks out of the way of my way I would normally came in. So anyhow, I hope it gets better from now on. I brought some books out here. Over my life, I've officiated over 1,200 marriages. And before, thank you, I'll show you one. Before I agreed to do a service of marriage, I always insisted on the pre-marriage counseling. And I always gave them, not only talk to them, I also gave them something to read later. Years later, I put all that material together in a book, which I entitled Marriages for Adults. And on my 50th wedding anniversary, I dedicated that to Patricia and so forth. Anyhow, the ones that I had, I was about to run out of them. So recently I decided to reprint it. And I did, and I have more than I need. So I brought some of these today. And maybe your marriages are just wonderful, but these make good gifts. If you've got children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews or any of those kind of folks, these make good little things to attach to a wedding gift or so forth. Anyhow, I brought some of the extras that I have free of charge, no charge to you. You're welcome to take as many as you'd like, wherever they are. Back on that back table back there. So after we get through, if you want to pick up a book or books, you're welcome to them. And in addition to marriage, there's some good principles about interpersonal relationships of all kinds. So feel free. I want to thank you for inviting me to be here these 4 weeks. And I want to thank you for all the thoughtful things you've done for Patricia. She had her birthday yesterday. She received a lot of get well cards, birthday cards. It was just overwhelming. So thank you for all that. CUC class has a special place in our heart. I've been with this group off and on for over 20 years now. And I'm especially grateful to Sandy for inviting me early in her presidency, because George and Sandy meant a lot to me, and they were responsible for the last book that I did publish. So we're thankful for that.
Copies are still available, Jim, by the way. I've got, I guess, about a half a dozen copies of your last book at home. I'll bring them next Sunday.
Okay. Anyhow, thank you for this opportunity. I enjoy it every time I'm here. The scripture for today is the 12th chapter of Mark, beginning with the first verse. Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, surely they'll respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. According to Mark, this is the last parable Jesus ever told. It took place during that last Holy Week, that first Holy Week, rather. For about 3 years or so, Jesus had been walking among the people, teaching them, healing them, blessing them, just living among them. And I believe, and I wrote in several of my books, that Jesus, although he talked to thousands of people, I think his primary mission was to prepare the disciples for the time when he was no longer with them and they would have to carry on his work. So he spent a lot of time with the disciples. Remember early on, he would say to the disciples, don't tell anybody about this. And there's a question, why would he say to people, don't tell anybody about this? Well, I think that fits with what I was just saying. Jesus did not want to confront the people who opposed him too early, lest he have a confrontation and his life on this earth be put to death too early. So he played for time to spend more time with the disciples to get them ready. And when they were finally ready, he thought, then he could go to Jerusalem and confront those who opposed him. So that's what this was happening. On that first Palm Sunday, he entered Jerusalem. And he did it in the way that everybody expected a Messiah to do it. I mean, their prophecies had talked about that. He went from Bethphage over the Mount of Olives, down through the Kidron Valley, through the Golden Gate into Jerusalem, riding on a donkey. That's the way they all expected the Messiah to do it. And so when Jesus did that exactly the way they expected to do it, he was making a claim. He was making a messianic claim. But he did not intend to become the kind of Messiah they expected. Now, they all expected another David to come along. David was the greatest of all the kings of Israel. And under David, the kingdom of Israel was all put together, all the tribes were put together in unity, and it was the strongest and most powerful they'd ever been. So they remembered David, and David was a warrior king. He was the one who defeated their enemies by raising an army and doing that. So they were expecting a David-like Messiah, someone who would raise an army and throw off the Roman oppressors and establish a strong Israel again. But Jesus never intended to be that kind of Messiah. And very early on, he did not do any of the things that people expected him to do. He gathered no army. He fought no battles. He did none of the things that expected their Messiah to do. Instead, when he entered Jerusalem, he cursed a fig tree because it didn't have any figs on it. Well, it wasn't even fig season, for Pete's sake. So why? But of course, it was not about the fig tree. The fig tree was a symbol of the temple. He criticized the temple because the temple was not producing the kind of fruit that God expected the temple to produce. And so the fig tree was a symbol. You're not producing fruit. The temple is not producing fruit that God expects. So then he went into the temple and he overturned the tables of the money changers, remember? He said, you have made you made this a den of thieves. It's intended to be a place of prayer, but you've made my temple into a den of thieves. Of course, the leaders of the temple were upset. They didn't like all this criticism. And they asked him, by what authority are you doing these things? And so he told this parable in an answer to that question. Now, let's get the setting of where it was. Let's assume that you are sitting where Temple Mount would be. Okay. You know, Temple Mount, that's where the ancient temple was built. Now, even Jews don't go up there because it's occupied by Muslims, and there are 2 mosques up on Temple Mount. Over here is the Western Wall, the ruins of the original temple, some of the walls there. It's the place where Jews consider it the holiest place in the world for them. And they go there to pray. You've all seen pictures of that. That's the Western Wall. You're at Temple Mount. And where I am here, back in this direction, are the steps, the ruined steps of the original temple. Stone steps, so they've worn away, but they're still there. Probably it was there on those steps that Jesus stood when he told this parable. Over here on that side, you've got the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane, and you've got Caiaphas' house where Jesus was taken prisoner. Yeah, all that's over there where you can see from the teaching steps. Oh, you suppose the teaching steps are where rabbis often stood and talked among themselves. The leaders of the temple often stood and talked among themselves. That they told some of their teachings there. Jesus told some of his parables there. I bet that's the same place that Mary and Joseph found Jesus when they thought he was with them, and they went back to Jerusalem and found him talking to the leaders of the temple. Probably there on those steps, which is where those kind of things happen. It's a really special thing to know that you're standing in a place that you knew Jesus stood. It's a very special thing. There are some places in the Holy Land that are traditions where people say this is where it happened, but you weren't exactly sure. In fact, I remember the first time we went to Egypt, our guide was out taking us out to the Nile, and he pointed down and said, "You see those bulrushes there? That's the very place where Pharaoh's daughter found little Moses floating in the bulrushes." And then with a twinkle in his eye, he said, "Several years ago, it was located further down the Nile, but we moved it closer to Cairo for the convenience of the tourists." There are places like that that are traditions, or people say something happened here. But those stone steps, they're about 50 yards wide. It was the main entrance to the temple, and they're still there. And you know, that's the real deal. That's the place where Jesus stood and taught. And so he told this parable probably from that location. Jesus often taught in parables. We've said that in the last 4 weeks. One of his favorite methods of teaching, who can forget all those parables he told them? Prodigal son, Good Samaritan, builders on rock and sand, the Pharisee and the tax collector, lost sheep, all of them memorable. According to Mark, this parable that I just read to you was the last parable Jesus ever told. And in some ways, I think it may have been his greatest. Because in that parable is caught up the central content of the whole Bible. It's sort of the gospel in miniature. Once we understand it, I don't think you'll ever forget it. Very, very special parable. Mark calls it a parable, but it's not like a lot of the other parables. Usually a parable has one main idea to it. And once you heard the parable, you say, okay, this is the main thing it's trying to say to us. But this one is more like an allegory than a parable, because everything in the story represents something else. Clearly, the owner of the vineyard is God. The vineyard itself is the world. I mean, it's us. The tenants were the priests, or the elders of the temple, those in authority. All this symbolic language had been used in the Old Testament. So those hearing this would be familiar with what he was talking about. The tenants in the story were like sharecroppers. You know, that they would take land that belonged to someone else and they would cultivate it, produce a crop, and then they would give the owner a percentage of what they had produced. That was done all the time in that first century world. Absentee landlords were common. People who owned it were here, but they were over there, and the tenants worked land here. Absentee landlords were common. So in this story, when the harvest had come, the owner of the vineyard sent messengers to collect what he was due of the produce of the land. But rather than fulfill the terms of the agreement, the tenants beat the messengers, sent them away empty-handed, some they even killed. Of course, these messengers in the story were the prophets, the ones sent from God to remind the people of what God was due. And what God was due? Well, it was the covenant. The whole thing is about covenant. Remember what the covenant was about? The covenant was about God promised on his part, I will be your God. I will watch over you with steadfast, dependable love. I will provide for all your needs. That was his part. And I will keep my part of the covenant, whether you keep your part of the covenant or not. And this is an unconditional gift from God. On their part, the people were saying, okay, we will be your people. You'll be our God. We will be your people. We will follow you faithfully, and we will do all the things that you command us to do. That was the agreement. And just think of all the messengers God had sent. There was Abraham and Moses and Jeremiah and Elijah and Amos and Hosea. All the prophets of Israel were people that God had sent to say, this is the covenant. Remember, you agreed to this. Now, you live up to your part of that. That's what the messengers, the prophets were supposed to do. Well, one by one, it happened exactly as Jesus said in the parable. The prophets were rejected. Some of them were beaten. Some of them were killed. That was what happened in history. And now Jesus is saying what God has sent is he finally forget one last effort. I'll send my son. Surely they'll respect my son. Surely they'll listen to my son. But him too, they were planning to kill. Just as Jesus had said. I think one of the pictures of greatest pathos in all the pages of the Bible. Remember, toward the end of his earthly life, Jesus went up on the Mount of Olives. He looked out over the city of Jerusalem and he wept. There's a beautiful little chapel at that place now. It's called Dominus Flevit. The Lord wept. Beautiful little chapel. And therefore, Jesus looked out over Jerusalem and he cried. He wept tears. He said, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings? But you would not. Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those who are sent to you, that's the past. How often would I have gathered your children together just like a hen gathers her brood under her wings? That's what I wanted to do, but you would not. All he wanted to do was love them. All he wanted to do was to bring them into a right relationship with the Father. All he wanted to do was to give them life at its best, that life that he called abundant. That's all he wanted to do. But in response, they rejected him and nailed him to a cross between two thieves. Harry Emerson Fosdick said that the world persecutes two kinds of people, and we see both there at Calvary. First, they persecute those who live beneath accepted standards, two thieves. But the world also persecutes those who live too far above the prevailing standards. And that's Jesus. Here in this parable, we see a dramatic depiction of divine love. Somehow God had to get through to his people. Somehow God had to let us know of the extent of his love. So century after century after century, God pleaded with us, sent messengers to us, begged us, pulled at our coat sleeve, trying somehow to let us know of his love and all the gifts that he wants to give us. But said what we did, we rejected his messengers, sent them away empty-handed, and some we even killed. Reminds me of the frustrations experienced by the mother of Helen Keller. Remember, Helen Keller, while she was still an infant, lost both her sight and her hearing. How can you communicate with someone who can neither see nor hear? And her mother cried out, "Oh, my precious little Helen, if there were only some way I can make my love known to you." That's God. Century after century after century, trying everything he knew to do to get through to us, to let us know of his love and the gift of life that he wants to give us. And finally he said, "I'll send my son. Surely they'll listen to my son. Surely they'll respect my son." Jesus was God's last best effort to get through to us, finally to communicate. I mean, how much more can you do than that? Sent Jesus, and finally Jesus himself was crucified. How much more can you do than to die for someone? I look at the dying form of that man on the cross, and I see there the clearest picture there is of the great heart of God. Here's a God who loves us enough to suffer for us. Now, we don't talk about that enough, folks. We talk about the greatness of God, the power of God, the omnipotence of God, all the greatness of that. We don't talk enough about the vulnerability of God. See, you and I touch one another most deeply, not at places of strength, but at places of weakness. Someone who's always right, always strong, always on top of things. You may admire somebody like that, but you can't get close to them. You can't get close to them. We touch one another most deeply at places of vulnerability. And here's the profound truth of life. You can't love someone without becoming vulnerable. You can't love someone and play it safe. Now, when you love someone, you say, "Here's my heart." All exposed, vulnerable. I want you to love it back. I want you to treat it tenderly, but I've given you the freedom to do whatever you choose to do with it. And I will suffer whatever you choose to do. That's vulnerability. That's love. And that's the great heart of God, which we see there at the cross. This parable, though, is not only about God's love, as great as that is. This is also a parable about God's patience. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I might have sent a messenger or two. But after that, I would have become angry. I would have called the police, had them arrested, taken to jail. I mean, they can't treat me like that. I wasn't messing around. But God, century after century after century, patiently sent messenger after messenger, prophet after prophet, and finally his own son, all trying to get through to us. I tell you, if I were God and I'd sent my son to tell him how much I cared, and if they'd taken my son and rejected him and beat him and tortured him and killed him, if I had the power to bring him back to life, do you think for a moment I'd send him back to those folks? Not for a minute. But that's what God did. After the resurrection, God sent Jesus back to him saying, I still love you. And I still want you to come back to be my people and be home where you belong. Wow. Amazing. Another thing this parable says is not only about those first century folks having to make a decision about Jesus, it's about 21st century folks also having to make a decision about Jesus. Back in the first century, most of the common people heard people gladly. They came to him often by hundreds or even thousands to hear him. They heard him gladly. It was mostly the leaders, mostly the people in authority who rejected Jesus and put him to death. But what about us? God has sent Jesus to us as well. We have a decision to make as well. Who is Jesus? And what does he have to do with us? Thomas Carlyle said if Jesus were to come back today in the flesh, we would never crucify him. I mean, we wouldn't do that. We're too refined for that. Carlyle said, first we'd welcome Jesus. Then we would lionize him. That way we make him some kind of celebrity. And then finally we just ignore him. It's yesterday's news. We ignore him. And you know what? I think that is the most painful choice of all. Just to ignore him. Above all else, Jesus wants to be taken seriously. Accept him as God's best effort to get through to us or reject him, one or the other. Either say yes or say no, but say something. The worst choice of all is indifference. To ignore him, to act as if he doesn't matter, that's the cruelest response of all. Just as God said about the church at Laodicea in Revelation, I wish you were either cold or hot. I mean, something. But because you're neither cold nor hot, but just lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. Something. Decide something, yes or no. Stuart Kennedy wrote a poem about it. He called it indifference. Listen. When Jesus came to Golgotha, they hanged him on a tree. They drove great nails through hands and feet and made a Calvary. They crowned him with a crown of thorns. Red were his wounds and deep, for those were crude and cruel days, and human flesh was cheap. When Jesus came to Roswell, they simply passed him by. Never heard a hair of him. They only let him die. For folks had grown more tender and they wouldn't give him pain, they only just passed down the street and left him in the rain. Still Jesus cried, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And still it rained, the wintry rain that drenched him through and through. The crowds all went and left the street without a soul to see. And Jesus crouched against the wall and cried for Calvary. Better to be crucified than to be ignored. Something. So what will we decide? This parable is a dramatic depiction of God's love and patience, but that's not all it's about. It's also about judgment. It's true that God has given us the freedom to do whatever we want with our lives. We can respond to God's love and live lives of beauty and nobility and usefulness. Or we can reject God's love, pretend as if there is no God at all, and start to mess things up. We're free to make bad choices. We are not free to make bad choices turn out well. God is not mocked. Whatever we sow, we reap. But the greatest tragedy is not Jesus' crucifixion, as great a tragedy as it was. The greatest tragedy is what happens in the lives of people who say no to him, who live as if there is no God and as if he's not a God of love and forgiveness and all the rest of that. As John wrote in his gospel, this is judgment, that light has come into the world and people love the darkness rather than the light. Now understand this, God is not in the punishment business. God is in the redemption business. So God doesn't go around punishing people. We do that by our own choices. We're not punished for breaking God's commandments. We're punished in breaking God's commandments because there's a moral law at work and there are consequences to our decisions. So this is judgment. If we reject all that God and Jesus have tried to tell us, then we will suffer the consequences of that. And that is judgment. It's really interesting. We think we're getting by with something, just like those tenants in Jesus' parable. You know, they thought they were putting something over on the landowner. You know, we may think we're putting something over on God by cheating him out of his due. All the while, do you know who we're cheating the most? Ourselves. I remember hearing about a little boy sitting on a curb crying. An adult came by and asked him what the problem was. And the boy said, all my day I've been hiding, playing hooky from school. Haven't done any of the things I enjoy because I've been hiding. Now this day is almost over and I found out it's Saturday. I wasn't playing hooky from school, I was playing hooky from myself. And that's why he was crying. Now that's the kind of judgment I'm talking about. But I don't want to finish with a word about judgment, because that's not the end of the story. God's love and patience, our rejection of it, all that leading to Jesus' crucifixion and death. And then the consequences that flow from that rejection. Those are all part of the story. But the story doesn't end there. As John wrote in his gospel, he came to his own people, and his own people did not receive him. But to those who did receive him, those who believed in him, to them he gave the power to become the sons and daughters of God. Now, the crucifixion is not the end of the story. Crucifixion was answered by resurrection. As Jesus said as he concluded his parable, the stone that the builders rejected has now become the chief cornerstone. Do you hear that? The rejected and crucified Jesus has now become the resurrected Lord. And to all faithful people everywhere, he's the one who holds it all together. He's the one who makes it all make sense. He's the one who, if we take him seriously, will give us a life that he called abundant. The rejected stone has become the cornerstone. Thanks be to God for that. I'll let my friend Maxie Dunham finish it up for us. Maxie tells about the time years ago when he and his wife Jerry visited what was then called Czechoslovakia. At that time, the church in Czechoslovakia was dominated by the Communist Party, and they were restricted, they were persecuted, they were not allowed to tell the Christian story, they were not allowed to evangelize, no sign could be posted outside their churches. They could make no public declaration. They couldn't even ring the church bells. And then in November 1989, a group of students, how many times have we seen that? A group of students confronted the government soldiers, and that brought everything out into the open. Everyone took to the streets, and the old communist regime knew that its old things were coming to an end. when Maxie was telling about the story, he said, Christians there told us the story of what had happened. It was decided that on November 27th at noon, everyone in the country would walk out of homes, business offices, factories, or fields. Everyone in the country would simply walk out into the streets at noon. Every bell in every church in Czechoslovakia would be rung at noon on that day. And so when that time came and people crowded out into the streets and church bells began to ring, it was electric. And everyone there knew that something new had come. Dr. Wilhelm Schneeberger, one of the pastors there in Prague, said for the first time in 45 years, they were able to put a sign outside their church. And so they put the sign out, and on that sign were just 4 words. The Lamb has won. Not the bear, not the lion, not the tiger, but the Lamb. The Lamb has won. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And we are people given the freedom to say yes. Yes. The cornerstone and the Lamb is won. Thanks be to God. Let's pray. God our Father, give us the grace this day to see who Jesus is, to say yes to him, and then to be counted among your faithful sons and daughters. Thank you again, Father, for your amazing grace. In the name of the Lamb, we pray. Amen. Don't forget about the books.
Very difficult to be the person that has to come up here to say an adequate thank you to Jim. I don't know anybody on this planet that makes the Bible come alive and makes the story of Jesus so resounding, resonant to me. I know I speak for everybody in this room and everybody on Zoom, thanking you for unparalleled weeks of teaching. We thank you so much.